from the given norm can be surgically mutilated. The individual may think that the most important reality is his own existence, but this is only his personal point of view. This lacks historical perspective. Man does not have the right to develop his own mind. This kind of liberal orientation has great appeal. We must electrically control the brain. Someday armies and generals will be controlled by electric stimulation of the brain. Dr. Jose Delgado, that from the Congressional Record number 26, volume 118, February 24th, 1974. Keep in mind the phrase, man does not have the right to develop his own mind. And because Mr. Delgado has some interesting views. I would also note, by the way, that Mae Russell, who wrote this article, was the first person in the country to hint that, or actually to state that mind control was possible, and this early work of hers has been borne out rather dramatically by research, much of which we're going to present you this evening. Keep in mind that phrase again of Delgado's, man does not have the right to develop his own mind, and we must electrically control the brain. That sounds less equivocal than his statements quoted by Lincoln Lawrence.
Yeah, it's especially interesting in light of the fact that this is a man receiving government aid, your tax dollars at work, to practice experimenting on mind control. And this is a man who feels it's evidence of a liberal orientation to think that people's brains should not be electronically controlled for the good of the state. Yeah, okay. All right, back to the book Were We Controlled by Lincoln Lawrence, and a little more information on Dr. Delgado and the Yale Project. Bear in mind that the earlier article from the New York Times published in Were We Controlled suggested that the experiment with a bull had taken place in 1964, according to that article, or a year before the time that article was written. Anyway, back to Were We Controlled. Perhaps, the author writes, there is a considerable gap of time between what Dr. Delgado and Yale announced today and what progress they have actually made. An amusing sidelight pointing toward this possibility came when a gentle bit of investigative scrutiny was applied to the good doctor's statements. In May of 1965, John Osmundson's excellent New York Times article refers to Delgado's flamboyant demonstration with the bull as having taken place, quote, last year, 1964, in Cordova, Spain. Although Dr. Delgado modestly avoids emphasizing the Spain episode in conversations at Yale, he nevertheless has a series of large photographic blow-ups of himself and the bull on the wall behind him. If you gaze at the pictures of the experiments on the wall and Dr. Delgado at the desk in 1965, you must notice that in Spain, Dr. Delgado was an athletic and striking, black-haired figure of a man who might even have stopped the bull bravely with a sword instead of a radio transmitter. Across the desk from you, supposedly a matter of, quote, months later, sits the distinguished gray-haired scientist of the moment. Why this unseeming skepticism, the author asks? Why this cynical probing and doubting as to whether we are being handed ancient history instead of the real news about ESB, so vital to the understanding of RHIC, and of course ESB, electric stimulation of the brain, and RHC we're going to hear about a little bit more in just a moment.
Okay. Now keep in mind the fact that Dr. Delgado either was lying in his teeth when he said that that the people who reported that Delgado's research had been done in 1964, that is, the experiments with the bull, were either lying in their teeth, or else Dr. Delgado went completely gray in 1 year. And keep in mind his equivocal statements about, well, he wasn't sure if radio control alone had been used to control animal behavior. Next, Lawrence presents some historical background as to how far back not only electrical stimulation of the brain, but also some of the root technology of RHIC, radio hypnotic intracerebral control, goes. Returning again to Were We Controlled? Let us compare the doctor's announcements with a paper offered by another equally well-qualified man of science. We refer to the late L.L. Vasiliev, V-A-S-I-L-I-E-V, professor of physiology at the University of Leningrad. We quote from Critical Evaluation of the Hypnogenic Method of the Results Obtained by Its Application, Improved Version of the Hypnogenic Method from Experiments in Mental Suggestion, unquote. It should be noted that we move a little further in the direction of RHIC as hypnotism is introduced into the procedure. Here are excerpts, quote, As a control of the subject's condition when she was outside the laboratory in another set of experiments, a radio setup was used. Not many experiments of this sort were carried out, but the results obtained indicate that the method of using radio signals substantially enhances the experimental possibilities, unquote. The date of this paper and for these experiments was 1934, 31 years before Yale's news, unquote, announcement. In another part of the paper, Professor Vasiliev reports, quote, Tomaszewski, I.F. Tomaszewski, famed Russian physiologist, carried out the first experiments with this subject at a distance of 1 or 2 rooms and under conditions where the participant would not know or suspect that she would be experimented with. In other cases, the sender was not in the same house and someone else observed the subject's behavior. Subsequent experiments at considerable distances were successful. One such experiment was carried out in a park at a distance. Mental suggestion to go to sleep was complied with within a minute. Here, over 30 years ago, was primitive RHIC in operation. It is inconceivable that the fraternity of science has not exchanged information, achieved similar breakthroughs, and progressed far past the announced point in this field. What then is RHIC? It is the ultra-sophisticated application of post-hypnotic suggestion triggered at will by radio transmission. It is a recurring hypnotic state, reinduced automatically at intervals by the same radio control. An individual is placed under hypnosis. This can be done either with his knowledge or without it by use of narco-hypnosis, which can be brought into play under many guises. He is then programmed to perform certain actions and maintain certain attitudes upon radio signal. The signal is practiced while he is under hypnosis to teach him, unquote, how to respond. Certain behavior can therefore be played, unquote, to use Dr. Delgado's term, over a period of days or even months. Reintroduction can be instituted by the same procedure to continue the control for an unlimited time. That, in essence, is RHIC. Take note of a couple of things in this passage. First of all, the fact that a person can be hypnotized without their knowledge. If someone can be administered any one of a class of drugs known as the sedative, or any one of several any one of a number of drugs that belong to the sedative hypnotic class of drugs, they can be placed in hypnosis without willingly submitting to the procedure. Now, some people can't be hypnotized at all under normal circumstances, but with the introduction of these drugs, and of course it's relatively easy for a military or intelligence agency to drug someone without their knowledge, anybody can be placed in a state in which they can be hypnotized. And it's worth noting here a couple of things about hypnosis, that a subject who is placed under hypnosis can be can have their memory of something erased, and what is known as a post-hypnotic block can be instituted. This basically would prevent, I really should say, the hypnotic subject from remembering the procedures which he was conditioned to perform while under hypnosis. And that's very, very important, that someone can be hypnotized to do something, and they can have all memory of that erased by a post-hypnotic block. Okay, and we're going to talk about a physiological means for messing up someone's mind and memory in just a second. Now, the means by which radio can be used to reinforce this hypnotic suggestion will be talked about in a second. Basically, we're looking at a cross between a conditioned reflex and a hypnotic suggestion, okay, a post-hypnotic suggestion. So it's really an intersection of several different psychological techniques and involves several different physiological and technological instrumentalities as well.
Okay, now bear in mind, too, as we've mentioned a couple of times, that most of this information, most of this material, and apparently, as far as we can tell, the state of art in most of these things was pretty old hat in 1967, 65, 69, when a lot of these books that we're working from were written. And the CIA themselves claimed to have stopped mind control operations in the late 60s, or in the mid-60s. That's as may be. You can decide for yourself whether you trust the CIA's word about that sort of thing. However, so we're talking about, at very best, we're talking about a technology that was already old hat 20 years ago. And you can extrapolate based on your knowledge of other types of medical and electronic technologies. Anyway, back to the book, Were We Controlled? And we're going to find out the companion term to RHIC and get that defined a little better. And Lawrence writes as follows: to our index of terms, add one more, EDOM. EDOM refers to electronic dissolution of memory. If that term causes you to sigh weakly and lean backward toward your shelf of science fiction, we refer you to the Berkeley meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 1965. There, EDOM surfaced for just long enough to be noticed. At that meeting, Professor J. Anthony Deutsch of New York University probably didn't realize he provided pioneer public substantiation of an important segment of the EDOM theory, but he did. Before we consider what his speech implied, let us define roughly what EDOM is. The Sub Rosa work in this field by the same men who developed RHIC is fraught with implication of space-age weaponry. To put it quite simply, EDOM enables man to juggle with other men's sense of time. It provides illusionary distortion of memory that destroys time orientation. For the execution of a crime, and in parentheses the author's written like the one in Dallas, because that is the theme that threads this book together, or the execution of an organized warfare tactic, EDOM offers unbelievable new powers. How does it work? Well, let's do a bit of homework. The basis of stored memory is the presence of a neutral transmitter substance, acetylcholine, that's spelled acetylcholine, at a synapse, which separates one nerve cell from another. EDOM, through the use of radio waves and ultrasonic signal tones, suddenly builds up an excess of the transmitter substance so that it cannot transfer excitation from one cell to another. It, in effect, blocks memory of the moment, which is our feeling of momentary time. It stops time for as long as it is placed in use. EDOM could therefore be used for, let us say, a period of several minutes to make someone skip over those minutes without being aware of the passage of time. Nice toy. We will see how it may have been brought into play a little later on. Professor Deutsch, in addressing the Berkeley meeting of the AAAS, described his work in this field, apparently with no awareness of its connection to EDOM. In a report entitled Anti-Cholinesterase and Dissolution of Memory, he notes, quote, "Too much transmitter, like too many cars on a highway, causes a jam and so stops transmission. An excess of acetylcholine stops transmission across the synapse," unquote. In his report, Dr. Deutsch describes the loss of memory due to the administration of a drug which raises acetylcholine levels. But according to the rumor, which again is the thread of the JFK assassination that he's following, according to the rumor, the developers of EDOM have managed to go a step further and stimulate the production of acetylcholine not by drugs, but by radio waves.